Hey everyone, it's Cindy. Um, it's October 3rd, 2024. This is Finding Truth Everywhere. And we're using a podcast from Roger Castillo today. I'll see what comes from that. Feeling emotional. It's an interesting thing. I don't know if anybody else feels it, but when I step forward and set the intention to join with everyone at an open door, I feel a real opening and an energetic shift. And sometimes it creates this sense of emotion flow or an opening. And so I have a song, and it's just the vocal today. So I'm just going to share sound and I'm going to hit pause, and Barbie's going to remember to remind me to turn the recording on again. That's your job, Barbie. This song um, represents how I feel in our community, and actually it represents how I feel um, whenever I step into this surrendered state. I got to be honest, that is not a screen share behind me. This is part of the community where I'm living for the next 30 days. And I don't know how I got here, except that I surrendered and living in the gap and trusting that love is real, maybe, or the truth is real. The words are really kind of funky. I don't understand them. Um, but this song represents um, what I sense we're doing when we say yes to all of this on a very deep level. So, for the recording, since I have to hit pause, it's called A Beautiful Day. It's by Paul. It's a vocal meditation, and it's Paul Luftenegger. It's in the open door playlist. Here we go. Got it. Thank you, Barbie. All right. So I may not be quite as prepared as I typically am, though I have listened to this set some. I listened to Roger more than once in the sharing, and I do have some notes. But interrupt me at any time, please. Key for me, that I'm looking as I'm looking at my notes that I wanted to share, that is alive for me to share based on sitting with him, is that teaching that we've talked about more than once, that I've now labeled the raft. And it's come up in some of how he shared, though. Um, I don't know. I don't even know why I picked Roger again, but it came up. I don't question these things. But what I heard him say, and what's very useful, and we've heard other teachers share, and it's the Buddhist teacher of the raft, he said this intellectual searching for what consciousness is, the hard problem of consciousness, and getting these concepts squared away and talking about them and really focusing on them. There's a real value in that to a point. It's useful to create the structure and have the conversation, and at some point we make this decision on this path to use the intellect to eat the intellect. I think that's the verbiage he said. At some point the mind kind of eats the mind, and then the um the interest the um the interest in understanding all these concepts die away, and we just stop thinking about it and we just live it. But until it dies away, that we're still looking at it and studying it, and for me anyway, letting go of believing that we're right or wrong for doing it is key for where we are right now. Enjoy the conversation as long as we're enjoying the conversation. But then at some point, Course in Miracles tells us at some point you close the book. And the Buddha teaching of the raft says you use the teaching and you use the physical teacher and the study to cross the river, but at the other end, you don't put the raft on your back, right? You burn it for firewood and move on, trusting that life is going to provide you everything you need, the concepts, the teachings, the whatever. And I heard that in Roger's satsang, and I was grateful for it. And I was also grateful because he does use a lot of languaging and he says some things that I don't understand and that the old me would have really wanted to kind of argue against and justify and say, but yeah, what? But I didn't feel that. Like I really was in this comfortable, open kind of space and appreciating that in his own way, he was giving that same teaching. So that's the first thing I wanted to share that I felt was very much the same of a lot of the other things that we work with. He also was really pointing to this discomfort, and I was grateful for that too. You know, how did I get here? And this is really important for me too, because because as I step more and more out of my comfort zone, which I've been noticing I'm doing. I'm like in another country right now with people I haven't spent time with that are at various levels of looking at things and have various backgrounds. And so I've really stepped out of my comfort zone. Um, there's this understanding that as long as there's this sense of being a human interacting with other humans, and there are different places on our journey. I used to have severe panic disorder. You know, there was a time where Cindy's story was all Cindy saw, and it was, you know, there was a tremendous amount of suffering in that. And then I went through this stage that, you know, as long as I was alone or with other people that thought the way I thought, um, then it was okay to just let go the story and coax. And I realized that there was this stage of um, impatience and frustration with other people attached to their stories. You know, I let go of my story. Why can't everybody else? And obviously, in that moment, I'm recognizing now that Cindy hasn't let go of her story yet. But there is this sense of recognizing that everybody is me, right? And so whatever I'm affected by, even by other people's opinions of their or attachment to their story or attachment to our suffering or whatever it is that's going on, that's all opportunities. And whatever it is here that's creating an upset. And it doesn't matter, right? Because that's another beautiful, by the way, the more I get, the quieter I get, and the more I say yes to all these teachings, the more I fall in love with A Course in Miracles, which is crazy since so many people think it's such a dualistic teaching and it's the progressive path and it has a lot of languaging that people have a lot of opportunities to argue against. And the languaging is there and it may be a progressive path, but you know what? What I'm learning that as a human, you know, in a human experience, I value the progressive path because I ain't there yet. Like I'm not just all consciousness. I have ups and downs. I have uncomfort. I get upset. And what is most valuable to me in those moments is whatever is the next high, like I'm going right back to my Abraham teaching, right? Just reach for the next best feeling, the next best teaching, and don't skip steps. Like it's really valuable for me right now, number one, not to skip steps, And number two, to recognize that if another person's attachment to their story or their suffering is upsetting here, then it's here I get to heal. And this, he was talking about how for those of us who he calls them seekers, I don't even know what that word means, but for those of us who are here in this meeting and are part of these conversations, there's this disturbance, this discomfort that arises. And the discomfort is a great tethering for me to recognize here is what's coming up to let go of or to look at or whatever. And isn't that wonderful? And so he used his languaging. This is what came up for me as I was sitting with his languaging. And he also pointed out, and Joel Goldsmith did too in the 60s, that most human beings have no clue and no interest in this conversation. Mm. I think Joel said 99% of the human population is never gonna, isn't interested, hasn't gotten that hook, is sitting in this story and not recognizing that there's something else. And falling in love with that is part of what's going on here right now. Like there's no desire to wake anybody up here right now. The desire is to recognize that there is only me, meaning there is only the I am or the isness in truth, and any sense of being separate from that can only be happening here. And I can because he is a student of Ramesh, and it was interesting because I think he ended his satsang with "Who cares?" That's the name of Ramesh's only book, is "Who cares?" And Ramesh was a student of Ramana Maharshi and is a Gadadhar Maharaj and did a lot of the translation work. And the "Who cares?" isn't a sarcastic statement. It's literally asking the question, who is it here that cares what happens next to the individual? Who is it that cares what's going on in the world? It's a legitimate inquiry question. Can you find the one who feels separate from the divine right now, who cares what happens next? Which is an extraordinary question when so many of our teachings are inviting us to just be here now. If we're literally living in the now, any projection into what happens next is a projection of something that doesn't want to hang out here now. And ultimately, and after this, I'm hoping someone interrupts me and shares. Because the other part of this, it's the same thing. The concepts are cool. They're so fun. And as long as all we're doing is talking about the concepts, then he called it clarity on the surface, which is no clarity at all. So it's very, very, very cool to take these concepts to the test and allow yourself to get uncomfortable and hang in whatever it is that's underneath the surface. Remember, the intellect is part of the aspect that ceases to be. It can't know the answer, right? So as long as we're using the intellect to try to figure this stuff out, we're kind of screwed. But if we can harness the intellect, which is what the course does, which is what a lot of the teachings do, turn the intellect back on itself and demand in a very gentle way to find the one who's trying to figure all this out. The intellect can be so valuable, so valuable in the looking. So we put it to work. All right. This is the first 20 minutes. All I've heard is really my voice. So looking forward to Amy's share. Hey, Amy.
Hey, I will say as I've told you, I found this video hard to watch, and I think felt the same way about the first Roger Castillo video, and it's just his teaching style is not it's not something that I, naturally find myself in alignment with, and I don't even know what I mean by that. And I thought about, doing a Cindy and rewatching it again. And then I thought, no, there are too many other teachers I really like, and I'm not going to rewatch this. So I appreciate your summarizing it. The thing, this is kind of my Sandra moment. I have these Sandra moments all the time because Sandra seems to continuously remind us that everything is arising in the one. And so the fact that 99% of other apparently separate beings aren't interested in um, this subject, that's just the way the one is moving. It's just the way it wants to have the experience of being asleep. And it's giving all of the rest of us who are on the path, or whatever you want to call it, the opportunity to see ourselves asleep, because it's all us. So um, that comes up for me. And then you talked about the discomfort, Cindy, and for me, part of that is living in not knowing. I love that phrase, and that idea of living in not knowing, because I realize that I'm in a slight discomfort, which I used to ignore for decades and decades and decades. And now I pay more attention to it because, as Helen Hamilton says, it's an opportunity for self-love. So that slight discomfort is just, for me, it's a pointer to remember I'm just living in not knowing. I'm walking backwards into the future, and or the apparent future, And so, but I love the question, who cares? So that's a great question. That's a new take on self-inquiry that I really appreciate. Thank you. Love us
Thank you.
all. Thank you. And I'm
So
happy,
it's,
everyone.
yeah, in dinner last night, Angelo DeLuo's name came up. And, what do you think about Angelo? And it was interesting because as I was listening to your response about Roger, I could almost say the same thing about Angelo. I have no opinion about Angelo. I just find that I don't spend time watching him. I read his book, and there's nothing in his book that I disagree with. And all the invitation to go read his book again, I just haven't sit like there's this sense that teachers at various points in consciousness, and Regina has taught me not to try to evaluate how awake somebody else is. That's an activity that only the thinking ego mind does. So what I've learned is that the teachers that are most useful for me come into my world, and ones that are not useful for me, I lose interest in. But that has nothing to do with the quality or the effectiveness or who they are. It's just more and more I have accepted that the guru that is coming alive, that is leading Cindy into knowing that she ain't a Cindy, she's an expression of consciousness, has to be here. And all outside teachers or teachings are something that has been projected by consciousness to help whatever's here, you know, express itself more fully. So there's no judgment about any of these teachers. And it's part of why we listen to so many of them. And I'm glad you appreciate who cares. There was something else, but from your share that I don't remember what it was. So if it comes up again, I'll share it. Hey, Barbie.
Hey, I got, first of all, I love your song so much. It almost brought tears to my eyes because of after I watched the video, I went to bed and I was laying in bed and it's like, I wonder if we do have a choice to make a different path for us. So I'm thinking when I was younger, I could have did this and I could have, and I would be, it's like a wonderful life I was going through. If I only would have did this, but then I would have met the people I know now, and I wouldn't have met my husband, and I wouldn't have the wonderful life I have now. But it's saying, then at the end it says, I love my life, so who cares? But I have two questions about video. First of all, I was very resistant at the beginning. It took me like 10 minutes. I mean, I was getting up, I was shaking, I was nervous, and my legs are trembling. It's like I didn't want to sit with it, but I knew I had to sit with it. And after 10 minutes, it was getting easier, but he was going on, and I didn't really understand what he was talking about. But what was he saying about primary and secondary suffering?
All right. So the first thing is here's my 2-second teaching on resistance.
Okay,
Resistance, the way I absorb the teaching from Regina, resistance comes from the ego, okay?
yeah,
And it means that the ego is being threatened. There's something that that part of the mind that wants to keep you small doesn't want you to sit with, right? And so when resistance arises, the best that we can, pretty much what you demonstrated, is that we say, I accept that the resistance is here. What Regina has taught me, that the greater the resistance, the greater the potential for transformation. So coming back and just not saying, I accept that the resistance is here, but I don't have to listen to it, which is what you did. You chose to say, being part of this group and sitting with the teachings and allowing whatever is going to inform me to be here is more important than listening to my resistance, and it eased. So what you stated was a testimony and a demonstration of how I've been taught to handle resistance. And that, again, has nothing to do with whether or not the teaching or the teacher is good or bad for us. When a teaching is not for us, there's a neutrality to it. And we almost just like lose interest. That's very, very different than getting nervous and jerky and rejecting it. And, oh, I hate this. Like there's no hatred in consciousness. So if there's I want to do anything but be here, there's an importance in looking at that and being everything that you just did.
okay,
Okay. Primary and secondary suffering. And again, I would never have used that languaging, but there's a core wound. There's a sense of separation. There's a sense of discomfort, right? That's the primary, is this energetic, what I am ain't that, right? So that's the primary suffering.
so that means somebody pissed me off, and that's my primary.
No, no. The energy of being upset is the primary. Just the
Okay,
energy, the feeling, the pain in the heart, or knowing that something's wrong, the angst is the primary. It's this
okay,
sense of separation from God. That's the
okay.
primary. All the stories we tell ourselves about why that suffering is happening is the secondary.
I understand it from you. I didn't get it from him.
Well, there was a lot, he used a
Yeah,
lot of languaging, and some of these teachings make it a lot more complicated. But literally, really, you can say the primary suffering based on the way you and I work together is the belief that I am separate from God. And
okay,
that's the primary suffering, right?
okay,
Is, I had this tiny mad idea and I forgot to laugh. And so now I'm having this experience. And there's 10,000 different ways that experience can manifest. But literally, the primary suffering is this space of separation. The secondary is all the stories we tell ourselves about the reason for the suffering or what we have to do to fix it.
Okay, got it. And the second one is, I didn't understand, what's the difference between the intellect and the mind? He says the mind has thoughts, the intellect somehow you could surpass that and achieve something. It's like, it was going over my head yesterday. I
Yeah, well,
guess I really didn't want to sit with it, but I did.
I can tell you the way I use it, right? And it's so interesting. There's so many different definitions of the word mind based on who you're reading at any given time. And when you're
Yeah.
asking me this question, and because I know you're a student of Joel Goldsmith, since we hang out together, Joel Goldsmith says there really isn't a mind. It's just a word that represents something that's going on.
Okay.
And you'll notice that every philosopher and every teaching uses mind however they want.
Okay.
So you can go inside and get yourself a definition for mind.
Okay.
Intellect, though, is another thing. Intellect to me is a focused use of this energy of intelligence, right? And depending on, again, you could use the intellect. So for you, I would like to suggest that you think of the intellect in terms of where you're focusing your attention. You could use your intellect to stay very worldly focused and look for solutions to the worldly problems, or you can turn around and use your intellect, which is really your attention and everything you've known, to turn back on yourself. You know, he said you can use the intellect to help the mind eat the mind, which essentially is to become the dancer instead of the human. So you could use your focus of attention to turn back and start dissolving everything that says I'd prefer to be thinking than to be living.
So that means when I was dreaming afterwards, after I listened to him, that's why I had these thoughts of I could have made a different choice, or that had nothing to do with it, but I sure practiced lesson 4 last night.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. See you
Yeah.
tonight.
That's the intention for sure. Hey, and we're at Awakening together from 6 to 8 Eastern. We listen to Joel and talk about it a little bit. Hey, David.
Hey, well, when I listened, I watched that video, and what I really got out of that was that Roger Castillo was so at peace with himself, and it was like he was just like exuding peacefulness. And so I believe that, I don't have necessarily agree with everything he said. I didn't disagree with anything in particular, but I did like the fact that he was just so peaceful. And and uh and then when people were talking about knowing today, and I wrote something this morning about knowing, and I like to read that if I can.
Of course.
All right, here we go. Not knowing is showing us where to find ourselves by being and seeing what is. Perhaps we are thinking that by knowing, we can feel safer, and this will bring us peace. Our fears will cease, but we can never get enough of what isn't the answer. And there are no answers to these questions, like why are we here? Does life matter? These are just like a loud patter of raindrops on a tin roof, noisy and disconcerting. Why ask why when we can breathe a contented sigh, rest and be and see that we are one with everything, and it is perfect because it is all there is. I've always, I mean, lately I'm getting better at it, but I always felt like I had to know every single little thing. I had to have the answers, because if I didn't have the answers, I went through life so frightened anyway. And I figured, well, if I knew the answers, I wouldn't be as afraid of life as I am. And the more I knew, the more I found out. I guess the more things I learned, the less I knew. And so I've learned that I don't need to know. All I have to do is be, and it's a lot better. And I don't have to be afraid anymore. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. And I could feel that in your heart. And the one thing before I hand it on off to Amy, the other thing that was in my notes that I don't believe that I shared is he pointed to the power of the satsang is really just in marinating in the energy of the satsang. It matters less what is actually being shared from a verbal standpoint. What's really and I've fallen in love with that word marinating, because basically he was just pointing, go to this beautiful place. I think he was going to be in Bali in October. So you're in this place like I'm here in a Ahihik, and you just, if you see me going like this, I haven't seen so many butterflies since I think I went to the Butterfly Conservatory in Niagara Falls and went inside, and there were hundreds of, like, there are butterflies all over the place. And I'm like, squirrel. So if you see me, it's not that I don't think you're gorgeous. It's just the butterflies are amazing. But he was just talking about, you come and here's an opportunity to be in satsang twice a day and be in an energy and just marinate in the intention. And when you were talking about the peaceful air and the sense that what he was really, it appeared to people that are his students, it appeared that what they were saying was, what a relief to just be here and know that I'm not the doer. And so the more I relax and open, the more it gets to be done. What a relief to know that anything I did yesterday, I didn't do it. They were really in that space. And that came up for me during your share, David. It feels like it was pointing to that.
Thank you.
Hey, Amy.
Thank you for sharing on my share.
You're welcome. All yours, Amy.
I love your poetry, David. It's kind of like a piece of thought prose. You put these ideas together in ways that are really lovely to hear. So thank you for sharing that. And Cindy, I wanted to say one of the things he said is the attitude of non-doership is the absence of the attitude of doership. So the attitude of non-doership is the absence of the attitude of doership.
There's nothing to do in it. It's not a doing.
Yeah, it's really good. And then he said, this is interesting too. He said, if we don't explore the nature of this ever-present consciousness, then we get stuck and we reinforce the mentation of the mind. If we don't explore the background of ever-present consciousness, we get stuck in this foreground of mentation. That's what he called it. And then the mentations are what feel real and unchanging.
Yes.
And that is, I think, an important thing it's a really subtle distinction. Like, if we don't step back and really become familiar with the ground of being and consciousness, then just this parade of thoughts that keep coming and coming, we think that's what's unchanging. So I really appreciated that. And he said the body and conditioning will continue along with all these executive functions after self-realization. They'll continue. So we'll get COVID and we'll be uncomfortable in the body and we'll wake up and feel discombobulated. That will continue after self-realization. But the psychological self that is composed of thoughts, memories, and objects, that begins to be seen as false. Because the consciousness that we are becomes more into the foreground. And so the psychological self begins to dissolve. And I appreciated that he said that. And the last thing I just want to ask everyone is, what do you all think of the title, "You Don't Stop the Suffering"? And Cindy, you let everyone else answer that one first, okay?
Yeah, but can I say
to.
something so I don't forget about it? I
Oh,
won't answer that one, but a
okay.
couple of things that came up. We watched a 5-minute Angelo video before the session I was doing here at the community, and Angelo was pointing to the real difference between no thought, not having any thoughts, and disassociating from our thoughts. Very different. And it came up as I was listening to you, and it's part of what we're doing here, right? The other thing is, and Rana will probably know this because I'm pretty sure it's from the Nisargadatta Maharaj class. You know, we're contemplating these talks, and one of the things that was coming up as I was with somebody share in that class that I'm facilitating is Nisargadatta Maharaj pointing to the fact that there is a deep psychological belief that the world we see is real, just because we've thought it so deeply, and just because we have thought into our existence, this world out there that has all this suffering, it doesn't make it more real. But there was a deep appreciation for the experience of its realness because it's been thought into existence on such a deep level.
Yes.
And that also came up as I was listening to you share. And again, it's this opportunity to understand that this experience, we are not to deny the fact that this human experience is happening. It's happening. But can we rest around it and see what happens when we do? So those are the two things that came up as I was listening to you. And Amy, if you want to ask that question again and then hand it over to Sandra.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, what do you think the title "You Don't Stop the Suffering" means? What comes up for you in that title? Sandra.
What comes up for me, well, there's a lot. I have to start with something else. I'll start with, I really liked when he talked about attitude to the flow of life. He said it depends on your attitude to the flow of life. It can create happiness or it can create suffering. Your attitude to the flow of life. I like that. I like the word attitude. I used to say it's, where do I come from? Do I come from awareness or do I come from the separate self? But that's all really one anyway. So this attitude, I like that. And you don't stop the suffering. I mean, I thought a lot of what he talked about was suffering. You know, I spent a lot of time resisting suffering at all costs. If I got a headache, give me a pill. I want the pill. I want to go away. I spent time resisting all kinds of suffering with intellectual reasoning. I could use that to try to stop the suffering. And then I reached a place where there was no way I could stop. I was at the end of my rope, and I finally accepted it. Some of the things he said about it. He said, it is completely normal and valid to suffer. You have no option but to play the role in the moment. That resonated with me. And I don't know if I can explain it, but I'll try. There's a reason I need to speak about this. I realize that. Wasn't going to, but it needs to come out. To stop the suffering means to try to cut off a whole part of the reason I'm here. It's like trying to amputate a part of the energy field. It's like trying to get rid of something that's part of the reason for even existing in this form. And I remember, I've spoken about this before, so those of you who've heard it before, sorry, I must need to talk about it again. It's just, well, I realized that it was when I finally realized that there are some things it's so appropriate to suffer for. It's right to suffer. It's right to grieve. It's the appropriate thing for the moment, for the experience. You know, it's part of the flow of life that he was talking about. And so when I finally accepted it, then he said something, suffering is a misunderstanding. Wow. I was misunderstanding suffering. Now I know suffering, not only is it a part of what I'm supposed to experience, I can't believe I'm going to say these words, but they're coming out. I can embrace it. I can say, yes, yes, this suffering means that I loved so much. This is a part of my love. It's not the opposite of love, right? It's a part of my love. And so this suffering, when I embraced it and I felt it fully, it did transmute. He used the word it transmutes. And oh, I love this other part that he said too. Allow the energy, he said, just feel it. Allow the energy to express itself. You can tell I was writing a lot of notes here, but he said, allow the energy to express itself fully. Let it become more and more. Let it intensify. Like wood burning on a fire. Love that metaphor because it burns itself out, doesn't it? It burns itself out. It transmutes. There's an alchemy that happens in the fire. And that alchemy happened in me. I've experienced it. I woke up relieved from the suffering when I stopped resisting. I resisted. I mean, there's different kinds of suffering. I want to acknowledge that right away. There's psychological suffering, there's loss, there's physical pain, you know, when something hurts physically. But there's something, there was one of the teachers you had on, Cindy, who talked about, who had a poem, The Alchemy of Acceptance. I loved that one too. And the like wood burning in a fire, and it has to be, he also said it has to be authentic, not conceptual, not intellectual. Authentic, really feel the suffering. So you don't stop it, but you embrace it. You love it because it's a part of the beauty of who I am, if that makes any sense. And then it lightens and it actually stops until the next one comes. And he also, I think, talked a little bit about spiritual bypassing, which I didn't know about till I came in this group. That I get the spiritual bypassing. It's like, oh, I'm a spiritual being. I can detach myself from the suffering because I'm not a body. That's not going to transmute it. That's not going to transform it. That's just going to put it off till the next big wave of pain comes over me. And so I don't do that anymore. I'm glad I don't do that anymore. I'm still tempted, though, I will admit that. And he did say it's counterintuitive, it's totally counterintuitive to do this. But I'm grateful. I always end with that. I'm so grateful. I feel so much love for this community. I feel so much love for just about everyone. I can't say 100% yet. I have a teacher who says there are no exceptions, there are no exceptions. But yeah, thanks for listening.
So I'm going to hand it to Chuck, but first I'm going to use these words that came up in a dyad recently, and pretty sure I might have shared them on Tuesday. But it came up as I was listening to Sandra, and it was the simple words: all that God sees is loved, cherished, cared for, and beautiful. And what God doesn't see doesn't exist. And I think it was in the 12-stepping meeting I shared that. And in any case, I've been using it as a mantra as things have been coming up during the travel and different things when I'm, wanting to judge something. It's just showing up in my space. Everything that God sees, all that God sees is loved and perfectly cared for and cherished and beautiful. And what God doesn't see doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's just becoming part of my practice.
I'm with David. I don't have to figure out why anymore.
You just get to
Like,
hang with
that just takes me down the wrong rabbit hole.
Well, if that's all, if that's the limit of my thinking abilities, then I'm stupid is good.
One last thing he said that I didn't fully understand, but I'm going to think about this. Allow the dark aspects to have their space too. He said that as well to the young man. I think his name was Eric that he was talking to.
Yeah.
And
It's funny that you say that, Sandra, because that line seems to be the same as your entire share. To me,
okay, yeah.
To me, maybe you don't understand it because you think it's something other than what you just shared. Your beautiful, crazy teaching to me, maybe what you're calling suffering is what he's calling the dark aspects.
Okay.
And maybe that's why you don't understand it, because you are living it.
The reason I think I don't understand it is because I no longer see that as a darkness. I see it as all light. It's all light to me now. And thank you. I need to talk anymore. Let somebody else.
Okay, Chuck, it's all yours.
Okay, well, so I got the whole suffering thing opened up, all kinds of, I don't have anything, if I don't know if anything that I say will have any connection to it all. At first, I never had chance to get to the video except that I tried. I got here earlier today than normal, and I clicked on the video, and for whatever reason it came up, but he never said anything. It never played for me.
He doesn't talk for the first 3 or 4 minutes, so it sounds like you were just impatient.
Oh, so that's what was confusing me. And then all of a sudden, Helen Hamilton appeared back up on the corner of my screen. So I just gave up and said, well, I'll come and hear what's going on and show up for whatever, and everything's being as it's supposed to be. This whole suffering thing, you triggered a lot of things with that. I don't know when he said, I somewhere I think back in the 12-step programming, even and before I got here, that heard the concept that pain was natural here, but suffering was optional. And then I got around the attitudes and finding that the removing these and the whole acceptance thing that Linda Joy is always on, and that I've got the version from the Course in Miracles and from the from the 12 steps around acceptance is what I, alleviates it when I give up, and the living loving all method from the other. I thought all that I've used as tools that is helped me eliminate carrying on and the suffering. But I don't know if any of that makes any sense, and I'm still kind of confused about that. And well, who's the you? I wonder. I'm starting thinking about who's the I or who's the you that doesn't do anything. And I don't know, maybe Cindy got there with that last comment about everything God sees that is love. So you gave me all kinds of things to process here now. I'm listening, grateful that I showed up, and I don't know if my share made any sense at all.
Well,
But love
yeah,
being here, and grateful to be part of this.
this is the one thing I'm going to say before I hand it over to Melanie. And it was coming up for me. I was looking at it during Sandra's share. I realized that I had a lot of definitions about around the word suffering, which points to the same thing you just said. You know, pain is guaranteed, suffering is optional. As I was listening to Sandra, there was this urge in me to argue against what Sandra was saying. And I looked at that instead of opening, and I realized it had everything to do with how I was taught what the word suffering meant. And I chose to let that go because all words are defined by the ego mind. And then it got further clarified for me when Sandra obviously had an idea of what darkness was, which was different than suffering, which was different than joy. And you just deepened it still, this idea that we think we know what words mean and we don't. We're talking about experiences here, and we're all have slightly different nuances relative to the words we're using to describe
Or
them.
said words are but symbols of symbols, right?
And we're just proving that here as we're looking at it and allowing the meaning of what everybody's share is to supersede the actual verbs. We don't have to argue about what words mean. We can
The
just
other thing
recognize.
that Amy said that I just remind me there's something that I heard along the way too, and that I think it was the same thing when they say before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. I don't know.
Yeah. Very cool. Melanie's in the house.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to absorb all this beautiful energy. And I did enjoy his to absorb, marinated in Roger's, just the way he talks. I get that piece, sense. But the one sentence that I picked out from what he said was life is very simple when you don't try to think about it. That kind of summed it up for me. Life is so simple when we don't we don't try to figure everything out, and just let it, this love what is, and just be the flow. And that's where, the suffering then is just part of, it's not suffering then at that point, it's okay. And it's so simple.
It's so okay. And it's so simple. And it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And Rana's going to close us out here.
I am. Hello, everyone. What was so great was I was able to check off every single one note that I had. Everybody touched on what I had written down and more, of course. But there's one I'm going to offer to you guys based on the one Melanie just shared with us. At the very end, he said to the questioner, I don't figure anything out. It just happened. And that's where I'm sinking these days. And even looking at when memories come up from the past, right? I see immediately how a meaning gets assigned. But if I can kind of zoom out and remember, that's just what happened, and then tying this attitude of non-doership, who did any of it? So Thank you for a wonderful hour. I've enjoyed listening to my notes come alive.
It's been a gorgeous hour, and now I think somebody's taking me to breakfast, which is pretty cool too. I love this very much. This has been William, you're unmuted. Is there something you want to say before I?
Just briefly, I'm so struck with Helen Hamilton, the words, I mean, and I'm feeling that awareness. I don't even want to use that word. I love the formless feeling, and I'm just spending more time looking at all of us, myself included, the separate selves that we all are. I understand more and more it's just all happening inside my five senses and my thoughts. And it seems like more and more they're getting more distant from me. That I'm floating in this space. And those are those objects that I see, but it's like we really are all one. And the subject, all of this is just, I feel like when I listen to the words, it's like I'm being spun around, losing my balance. And then I stop because it's all thoughts. They're just thoughts, and I'm reminding myself over and over and over. Just thought, I don't have to believe any of them. I'm just going to be. And when I said be this morning, it's like be, not me, be, not me, be, not me.
Oh,
That's
awesome.
the one thing.
And with that, I'm going to hit stop record.